I think the criticism that people would say about your talking about COVID, and maybe you can correct me, but you were skeptical, or you were against skepticism of the safety and efficacy of the vaccine. So people who get nervous about the vaccine, but don't fall into the usual anti-vax camp, which I think there was a significant
Yeah, that was.
enough number.
Oh yeah.
They're getting nervous. I mean, I, especially after the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, I too was nervous about anything where a lot of money could be made.
Hmm.
And you just see how the people who are greedy, they come to the surface all of a sudden. And a lot of them that run institutions are actually really good human beings. I know a lot of them, but it's hard to know how those two combine together when there's hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars to be made. And so that skepticism, I guess the sense was that you weren't open enough to the skepticism.
I understand that people have that sense. I'll tell you how I thought about it and think about it. One, again, it was a moving target. So there was a point in the timeline where it was totally rational to expect that the vaccines were both working, but both they were reasonably safe, and that COVID was reasonably dangerous, and that the trade-off for basically everyone was it was rational to get vaccinated, given the level of testing and how many people had been vaccinated before you, given what we were seeing with COVID, right? That was a forced choice. You're eventually going to get COVID, and the question is, do you want to be vaccinated when you do, right? There was a period where that forced choice, where it was just obviously reasonable to get vaccinated, especially because there was every reason to expect that while it wasn't a perfectly sterilizing vaccine, it was going to knock down transmission a lot, and that matters. And so it wasn't just a personal choice. You were actually being a good citizen when you decided to run whatever risk you were going to run to get vaccinated, because there are people in our society who can't get vaccinated. I mean, I know people who can't take any vaccines. They're so allergic to. I mean, they in their own person seem to justify all of the fears of the anti-vax cult. I mean, it's like they're the kind of person who Robert Kennedy Jr. can point to and say, "See, vaccines will fucking kill you," right? Because of the experiences, and worse still, I know people who have kids who fit that description, right? So, we should all feel a civic responsibility to be vaccinated against egregiously awful and transmissible diseases for which we have relatively safe vaccines to keep those sorts of people safe.
And there was a period of time when it was thought that the vaccine could stop transmission.
Yes. And so again, all of this has begun to shift. I don't think it has shifted as much as Brett Weinstein thinks it's shifted. But yes, there are safety concerns around the mRNA vaccines, especially for young men, right? As far as I know, that's the purview of actual heightened concern. But also there's a lot of natural immunity out there. Basically everyone who was going to get vaccinated has gotten vaccinated. The virus has evolved to the point in this context where it seems less dangerous. Again, I'm going more on the seemings than on research that I've done at this point. But I'm certainly less worried about getting COVID. I've had it once. I've been vaccinated. So you ask me now, how do I feel about getting the next booster? I don't know that I'm going to get the next booster, right? So I was somebody who was waiting in line at 4 a.m, hoping to get some overflow vaccine when it was first available. And that was at that point, given what we knew, or given what I thought I knew, based on the best sources I could consult, and based on anecdotes that were too vivid to ignore, both data and personal experience, it was totally rational for me to want to get that vaccine as soon as I could. And now I think it's totally rational for me to do a different kind of cost benefit analysis and wonder, listen, do I really need to get a booster? Right? Like how many of these boosters am I going to get for the rest of my life? Really? And how safe is the mRNA vaccine for a man of my age, right? And do I need to be worried about myocarditis for, all of that is completely rational to talk about now. My concern is that at every point along the way, I was the wrong person and Brett Weinstein was the wrong person. And there's many other people I could add to this list to have strong opinions about any of this stuff.
I just disagree with that. I think, yes, in theory, I agree 100%, but I feel like experts failed at communicating, not at doing.
They did.
I just feel like you and Brett Weinstein actually have the tools with the internet, given the engine you have in your brain of thinking for months at a time deeply about the problems that face our world, that you actually have the tools to do pretty good thinking here. It's the problem I have with experts.
But there would be deference to experts and pseudo experts behind all of that.
Well, the papers, you would stand on the shoulders of giants, but you can surf those shoulders better than the giants themselves.
Yeah, but I knew we were going to disagree about that. Like I saw his podcast where he brought on these experts who had, many of them had the right credentials, but for a variety of reasons, they didn't pass the smell test for me. I mean, one larger problem, and this goes back to the problem of how we rely on authority in science, is that you can always find a PhD or an MD to champion any crackpot idea, right? You could. I mean, it is amazing, but you could find PhDs and MDs who would sit up there in front of Congress and say that they thought smoking was not addictive, or that it was not harmful to. There was no direct link between smoking and lung cancer. You can always find those people, and you can. So, but some of the people Brett found were people who had obvious tells, to my point of view, to my eye. I mean, and I saw them on some of the same people were on Rogan's podcast, right? And it's hard because if a person does have the right credentials, and they're not saying something floridly mistaken, and we're talking about something where they're genuine unknowns, right? Like how much do we know about the safety of these vaccines, right? It's at that point, not a whole hell of a lot. I mean, we have no long-term data on mRNA vaccines. But to confidently say that millions of people are going to die because of these vaccines, and to confidently say that ivermectin is a panacea, right? Ivermectin is the thing that prevents COVID, right? Mm-hmm. There was no good reason to say either of those things at that moment. And so given that that's where Brett was, I felt like there was nothing to debate. We're both the wrong people to be getting into the weeds on this. We're both going to defer to our chosen experts. His experts look like crackpots to me, and or at least the ones who were most vociferous on those edgiest points that seem most.
And your experts seem like, what is the term? Mass hysteria. I forgot the term.
Well, it's like with climate science. I mean, this old. It's received as a canard for in half of our society now, but the claim that 97% of climate scientists agree that human-caused climate change is a thing, right? So do you go with the 97% most of the time, or do you go with the 3% most of the time? It's obvious you go with the 97% most of the time for anything that matters. It's not to say that the 3% are always wrong. Again, there are things get overturned, and yes, as you say, and I've spent much more time worrying about this on my podcast than I've spent worrying about COVID. Our institutions have lost trust for good reason, right? And it's an open question whether we can actually get things done with this level of transparency and pseudo transparency given our information ecosystems. Like, can we fight a war? Really fight a war that we may have to fight, like the next Nazis? Can we fight that war when everyone with an iPhone is showing just how awful it is that little girls get blown up when we drop our bombs, right? It's like, could we as a society do what we might have to do to actually get necessary things done when we're living in this panopticon of just, everyone's a journalist, right? Everyone's a scientist. Everyone's an expert. Everyone's got direct contact with the facts or a semblance of the facts. I don't know.
I think yes, and I think voices like yours are exceptionally important, and I think there's certain signals you send in your ability to steal me on the other side, in your empathy, essentially. So that's the fight. That's the mechanism by which you resist the dogmatism of this binary thinking. And then, if you become a trusted person that's able to consider the other side, then people will listen to you as the aggregator, as the communicator of expertise. Because the virologists haven't been able to be good communicators. I still, to this day, don't really know what is the what am I supposed to think about the safety and efficacy of the vaccines today, as it stands today.
Right.
What are we supposed to think? What are we supposed to think about testing? What are we supposed to think about the effectiveness of masks or lockdowns? Where's the great communicators on this topic that consider all the other conspiracy theories, all the communication that's out there, and actually aggregating it together and be able to say this is actually what's most likely the truth? And also, some of that has to do with humility, epistemic humility, knowing that you can't really know for sure. Just like with depression, you can't really know for sure.
Yeah.
Where's I'm not seeing those communications being effectively done, even still today.
Well, I mean, the jury is still out on some of it. And again, it's a moving target. And some of it, I mean, it's complicated. Some of it's a self-fulfilling dynamic where, like lockdowns, in theory, a lockdown would work if we could only do it, but we can't really do it. And there's a lot of people who won't do it because they're convinced that this is the totalitarian boot, finally on the neck of the good people who are always having their interests traduced by the elites, right? So like this is, if you have enough people who think the lockdown for any reason in the face of any conceivable illness, right, is just code for the new world order coming to fuck you over and take your guns, right? Okay, you have a society that is now immune to reason, right? Because there are absolutely certain pathogens that we should lock down for next time, right? And it was completely rational in the beginning of this thing to lock down, to attempt to lock down. We never really locked down. To attempt some semblance of a lockdown just to, quote, bend the curve, to spare our healthcare system, given what we were seeing happen in Italy, right? Like that moment was not hard to navigate, at least in my view. It was obvious at the time. In retrospect, my views on that haven't changed, except for the fact that I recognize maybe it's just impossible, given the nature of people's response to that kind of demand. Right, we live in a society that's just not going to lock down.
Unless the pandemic is much more deadly.
Right, so that's a point I made, which was maliciously clipped out from some other podcast where someone's trying to make it look like I want to see children die. Look, there's a pity more children didn't die from COVID. Right, this is it was actually the same person who I mean, that's the other thing that got so poisoned here. It's like that person, this psychopath or affective psychopath who's creating these clips of me on podcasts. The second clip of me seeming to say that I wish more children died during COVID, but it was so clear in context what I was saying that even the clip betrayed the context, so it didn't actually work. This psycho, and again, I don't know whether he actually is a psychopath, but he's behaving like one because of the incentives of Twitter. This is somebody who Brett signal boosted as a very reliable source of information, right? He kept retweeting this guy at me, against me, right? And this guy, at one glance, I knew how unreliable this guy was, right? But I think I'm not at all sad. One thing I think I did wrong, one thing that I do regret, one thing I have not sorted out for myself is how to navigate the professional and personal pressure that gets applied at this moment where you have a friend or an acquaintance or someone who's behaving badly in public or behaving in a way that you think is bad in public. And they have a public platform where they're influencing a lot of people. and you have your own public platform where you're constantly getting asked to comment on what this friend or acquaintance or colleague is doing. I haven't known what I think is ethically right about the choices that seem forced on us at moments like this. So, like, I've criticized you in public about your interview with Kanye.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in that case, I reached out to you in private first and told you exactly what I thought, and then when I was going to get asked in public, or when I was touching that topic on my podcast, I more or less said the same thing that I said to you in private. Right now, that was how I navigated that moment. I did the same thing with Elon, at least at the beginning. This we have maintained good vibes, which is not what I can say about Elon. But
I don't think so. I disagree with you, because good vibes in the moment, there's a deep core of good vibes that persists through time between you and Elon, and I would argue probably between some of the other folks you mentioned.
I think with Brett, I failed to reach out in private to the degree that I should have, and we never really had we had tried to set up a conversation in private that never happened, but there was some communication. But it would have been much better for me to have made more of an effort in private than I did before it spilled out into public. And I would say that's true with other people as well.